In this week's lecture, we are going to be looking at what is known as public history. That is how history is presented to the public in the form of, in this case, of an exhibit that appears in the mid-1990s in the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, in doing so, we are going to pick up on some themes that we've talked about in previous lectures. So, for instance, going all the way back to the start of the semester, we talked about how historians and the historical profession became modern, if you will, when it became professionalized. And it became professionalized when it started to focus on facts, the idea of looking for evidence in the archives to tell the story of the past. But at the same time, in addition to seeing that issue spring up again when we're discussing the so-called Enola Gay controversy, we're also going to talk about how some of the things that we discussed in the past weeks when we were talking about radical history, when we were talking about Howard Zinn, how those ideas also transpire. Because we are going to see the so-called revisionist historians of the 1960s that were sort of existing in parallel and in tandem with some of the radical history of that same era spring up here. And what we are going to find is that sort of history, that so-called revisionist history, is quite controversial for a public that really doesn't understand what history is all about. So nonetheless, with that very basic overview out of the way, let's get started with talking about the Enola Gay controversy here in the 1990s. As you can see, we are going to begin this lecture by talking about the tricky business of commemoration. And this has to do, again, a lot with the divide between historians and what they do on a daily basis and what the public understands as history and the purpose of history. So nonetheless, a little background here. In November of 1994, the fuselage, meaning the body without the wings, of a B-29 bomber was being transported along Independence Avenue in Washington, D.C. Now, this massive cavalcade of trucks and the fuselage itself was en route to the Smithsonian's Air and Space Museum for a planned exhibit the following year. This planned exhibit was going to be known as The Last Act, the Atomic Bomb and the End of World War II. And again, it was set to open in May of 1995. The B-29 in question, the B-29 bomber in question, was named the Enola Gay. It was responsible for dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan, early in the morning of August 6, 1945. Now, for several decades since the end of World War II, the Enola Gay had actually been at various sites across the United States, often in sort of a kind of ramshackle position. It was often unprotected, it was filled with rodents, it was generally forgotten by most Americans. So I bring that up because here we are talking about a controversy in the 1990s, and for really the past 50 years, most Americans could care less about what was happening with the Enola Gay. So in short, I just again bring this up because it shows that what we are seeing here is this weird sort of interaction that is going to take place here with this Enola Gay exhibit between professional historians and the general public. So nonetheless, what we are going to see is again in the spring of 1945, this aircraft, the B-29 Enola Gay, will become the center of a controversy that extended from the halls of academia to the U.S. Congress. So to be clear, and this is why I titled this slide, that historical commemorations are very tricky. And as a result, organizers must ask the question, whose voice will be heard? Whose voice will be heard? Now, Smithsonian officials, as they were planning for this exhibit to begin in the spring of 1995, they were very much of the mindset that this would be an all-encompassing exhibit. It would provide evidence from professional historians. It would commemorate the past, celebrate the past. For instance, what we are going to see is officials would repeatedly promise that the exhibit would, quote, present all the differing views, in the words of the principal curator of this exhibit, a guy by the name of Michael Neufeld. So I want to talk a little bit here about the two main groups of voices, if you will. Now, on the one hand, you have the victims, the ones who were impacted dramatically by this Enola Gay. the ones who felt the destructive power of the atomic bomb that was dropped from this B-29 bomber. So interestingly enough, what we are going to see as this discussion is going on about what this exhibit would look like, Smithsonian leaders actually met with a delegation of Japanese officials from Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early 1994. Nagasaki, of course, being the other city that was bombed 3 days later on August 9, 1945, by the atomic bomb. Now, the Japanese made clear that they did not want the exhibit to glorify the dropping of the atomic bombs on their cities. And in fact, even Japanese Americans felt a bit of concern over what this exhibit would entail in terms of explaining what the bombing was all about. So for instance, a Japanese American resident living in Washington wrote to the mayor of Hiroshima that the Enola Gay belonged, in the words of this Japanese American, quote, in the Holocaust Museum. Again, because of the hundreds of thousands of people that were killed when these bombs were dropped. This was not something to again glorify in the minds of this Japanese American. So nonetheless, that's one voice that the organizers of this exhibit, the Enola Gay exhibit, had to deal with. Now, on the other hand, U.S. veterans wanted an exhibit that commemorated the sacrifices that they had made in what they considered to be a just cause. They did not see U.S. actions in Japan as aggressive or the atomic bombings as unnecessary or wrong. Now, these viewpoints held by these U.S. veterans, particularly the notion that the United States did not act aggressively in Japan or that the atomic bombs were unnecessary or wrong, would become the key clash points between them, the U.S. veterans, and professional historians. But nonetheless, as you can see here, this airplane, basically an artifact, will become a bone of contention, as we'll see in upcoming slides. To be clear, the Enola Gay B-29 bomber held no significance in and of itself. And in fact, the controversy over the Enola Gay stemmed from the desire of Smithsonian officials to really see the exhibit as more than just a display of historical artifacts. The organizers of this exhibit did not simply want to put the airplane there with a sign that said the Enola Gay on August 6, 1945, it dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, which helped bring an end to World War II and force the unconditional surrender of Japan. That's not what the Smithsonian officials wanted. Rather, they thought that this exhibit would be an exercise in historical thinking due to the exhibit's planned consideration of the historiography of the Cold War. So in short, what we are seeing here is essentially an effort, as I'll talk about in a second here, of bringing historiographical debates, like we've been talking about throughout the semester, to the public. But as we'll see, the public was really not prepared for these historiographical debates. But nonetheless, in short, an overarching goal for Smithsonian officials was that this exhibit, the Enola Gay exhibit, would represent in their minds historical reality more than personal memory, which explains, again, its reliance on professional historians rather than veterans. Because what we are going to see, of course, is a lot of these historians had written books. They culled through the archives. They found the evidence. That's what the Smithsonian officials were interested in, documentable evidence, helping the viewer of these exhibits, the patrons who look at these exhibits at Smithsonian, to understand what was really going on behind the scenes. The Smithsonian officials did not simply want the memories of the veterans, because obviously the memories are going to be clouded by their own circumstances and various other biases. So nonetheless, what we are going to see is, in particular, the Smithsonian considered the ideas of a group of historians who were known as the revisionist historians. And now these revisionist historians, who played a role in this debate over the Enola Gay exhibit, they were involved in a discussion particularly regarding the issue of whether Harry Truman should have dropped the atomic bomb here in August of 1965. Now, the usual argument that was given in the aftermath of the bomb being dropped was the fact that Harry Truman made a pragmatic decision. And the reason why that was is defenders of dropping the bomb on August 6, 1945 and August 9, 1945 was that Harry Truman used the bomb to save lives. As the story goes, if Harry Truman had not given order to drop the bomb, the only other way that the United States was going to defeat the Japanese was through a land invasion. Actually, an amphibious invasion onto the island of Japan. And that would have led to hundreds of thousands of deaths and possibly other casualties as well. So as a result, the idea was, and the argument was, is that Harry Truman did a good thing by dropping this bomb. At the end of the day, he actually saved lives. Well, according to these revisionist historians, they suggested that U.S. President Harry Truman actually used the bomb not for these military reasons, i.e. lowering American casualties, but rather he ordered the use of the atomic bomb in order to increase the power of the United States in the post-war world, particularly in relation to the Soviet Union. The idea being that with this bomb essentially on their hip, the United States could now determine post-World War II affairs across the globe. No other nation had a nuclear weapon during this time, so if the United States had it and they showed its destructive potential in Japan, nobody would confront them, and the United States could essentially run roughshod over the rest of the world and make decisions about what the globe would look like. So this idea became known among revisionist historians as, quote, atomic diplomacy. Atomic diplomacy. The most famous account that put forth this argument of atomic diplomacy was published in 1965, and that was Gar Alperovit's Atomic Diplomacy, Hiroshima and Potsdam. Now here's the thing, and this is why I bring up this example. This was obviously 30 years before the controversy of the Enola gay exhibit. So this revisionist story that I just told you was nothing new among professional historians. It had been around for decades, so they were used to it. But this just shows you the massive divide. And I mean, this fits perfectly with what we talked about in this class, the book that you read for the book review this semester about popular history. How rare it is for historians and their ideas to reach the public. This is an example of that. It did not reach the public for 30 years. So therefore, when they learn about this revisionist history, they're shocked and it's controversial. But again, for most professional historians, it's not the case. So therefore, when these professional historians are brought on to help create this exhibit with the Smithsonian Institute, they put these ideas out there to be told in this exhibit, and they don't think anything of it. But then all of a sudden, the public gets wind of it, and that's when the controversy starts to arise. So nonetheless, interestingly enough, when these critics begin to confront the Smithsonian and criticize this exhibit, we will actually see the Smithsonian defend it by pointing to the involvement of these professionally trained historians. So this is that idea of the professionalization of history, sort of the hierarchy, that these are professional trained historians. Again, they've scoured the archives, they know what they're talking about, so this is how the Smithsonian is going to defend that. And in fact, in a 1994 news release by the Smithsonian, a guy by the name of Barton Bernstein was quoted. Now, he was a revisionist historian, and again, interestingly enough, we read him. Our first assignment this semester was talking about Cold War revisionism, what I've been talking about here. So Barton Bernstein was actually quoted in this news release, and he was actually involved in the writing of the script for the exhibit itself. So he was one of the historians who was hired by the Smithsonian. Nonetheless, this guy, Barton Bernstein, he said in this news release that this exhibit, quote, reflected the current scholarship of the war, and that it was in his mind, quote, fair, balanced, and historically informed. Well, here's the only problem. Without a doubt, what Barton Bernstein and the other historians who were involved in this exhibit were doing was fair, balanced, and historically informed. But again, for the public, they didn't want that. They wanted something that was more celebratory, to look back at what happened with this Enola Gay and to celebrate how it was used to end the war. They don't want to hear about all the depressing stuff, about the deaths to the Japanese, about the questions over whether it was even necessary to use this deadly weapon. They wanted pure celebration, and that clashed with, again, this idea of historical reality. So I want to build now in this slide on this idea of history versus memory. Because what we are going to find is historians, again, even as they went to the archives, they did tons of research, read the documents, they were on solid ground. That didn't matter, because what we are going to see is U.S. veterans would ridicule such an approach, which in their eyes silenced the voices of those actually involved in fighting World War II. For these World War II veterans, lived experiences held more weight than the ability to scour the archives for evidence of past events. One of these veterans, a guy by the name of W. Burr Bennett, he was a veteran from Illinois, described the Plan exhibit in the Smithsonian as, in his eyes, quote, insult to every soldier, sailor, marine, and airman who fought the war against Japan. Brigadier General Paul Tibbets, the man that we see on the left, obviously much later in life, he was actually the individual, he was a pilot who flew the Enola Gay on that fateful mission on August 6, 1945, when the atomic bomb was dropped. He complained of the exhibit, quote, they're trying to evaluate everything in the context of today's beliefs. And as a result, he considered the exhibit, quote, a damn big insult. In other words, these veterans did not want to consider the evidence offered by revisionist historians, no matter how truthful, no matter how real. Instead, these veterans wanted a patriotic celebration for the heroic deeds that they and the men who never came back from World War II carried out. And that is, again, why we had this clash here over this exhibit in the mid-1990s. As a result, what we are going to see is these veterans, who are oftentimes in their 60s, 70s, and older, they are going to put on their boots again and they are going to fight another battle. This time against the historians who are involved in the Smithsonian exhibit of the Enola Gay. And what we are going to find is that these veterans, angered, will organize opposition to the exhibit on various different fronts. For instance, Burr Bennett, who I mentioned in the previous slide, the veteran from Illinois, helped to organize the Committee for the Restoration and Display of the Enola Gay. Now this committee, this group, was composed of veterans who had flown the B-29s during the war. And as a result, they would again put forth this idea that they really knew what happened in World War II. Well, nonetheless, this group, the Committee for the Restoration and Display of the Enola Gay, would circulate protest petitions across the country. By April 1994, the group had gathered more than 9,000 signatures. What were these 9,000 signatures calling for? Well, the petition demanded that the Smithsonian simply display the Enola Gay B-29 bomber without any sort of commentary or reference to Truman's decision to drop the bomb. Again, moving past this controversy, they said, requires us to forget what actually happened. Forget the question of whether Truman actually needed to order the dropping of this bomb and simply look at what happened. And that was that the bomb was dropped and that this plane was a piece of history and those who flew this plane deserved respect and celebratory messages for their heroic actions. So as this petition is spreading around, we are going to see another organization soon join the fray, and that is the Air Force Association. And the Air Force Association would lead the charge against what it described as a, quote, politically correct curating of the Smithsonian exhibit. The politically correct curating of the Smithsonian exhibit. For instance, what we are going to see is in its April 1994 issue of Air Force magazine, the Air Force Association published the following. Now, what I'm going to point to here, this is, so on the bottom is the Air Force magazine that I was referring to, and in April 1994 issue, again, this is exactly when that petition that I talked about previously, Burr's petition, is being sent around. They would basically post a review of the script for the Enola Gay exhibit. And here's what this Air Force Association said about that exhibit. They found 49 photos of Japanese casualties versus only 3 photos of American casualties. So obviously, the point being that this exhibit is harping on the victims of American policy, but ignoring the violence perpetrated by the Japanese against the Americans. Again, there's too many photos of the Japanese dead and not enough photos of the American dead, which would make it seem like America was the one doing all the killing, when in fact the Japanese were doing just as much. That's what the Air Force Association was alluding to with these numbers. Secondly, they would talk about the total number of pages in this script for the exhibit, 302 total pages. And according to the Air Force Association, only 3 of those pages referred to Japanese atrocities. Again, making the Japanese look too innocent and too good-natured. In comparison, there were 66 pages on Ground Zero where the bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Additionally, you are going to see 13 text pages on Japanese casualties suffering damage from earlier B-29 missions. So the idea again is that when patrons, when American citizens come into the Smithsonian and they see this exhibit, they're going to be inundated. They're going to be forced to confront all of these terrible pictures of Japanese who are dead, the pure destruction caused by these bombs. They're going to have to see that, and they're not going to see a lot of the opposite. The difficulties that Americans face, the dangers that American soldiers faced, and therefore, again, in the minds of the Air Force Association, this was sending the wrong message. Again, to go on, basically 2 pages of text on Japan's search for a diplomatic solution, and even more pages, 4 text pages on U.S. avoidance of a diplomatic solution. Again, portraying this idea that the United States does not want to seek a diplomatic solution. They are aggressors. They want to use the bombs to completely obliterate the Japanese. Finally, the Air Force Association argued that there was only 1 aggressive anti-American statement by the Japanese in the exhibit, compared to 11 aggressive anti-Japanese statements by Americans. So this idea again that there's a lack of balance. That's in short what the Air Force Association was arguing here, is that it is making the United States and it's making veterans look bad, like they were the bad guys in this war. This was supposed to be the good war with the good veterans. That's not the case according to the Air Force Association that is being presented in this exhibit. So nonetheless, this controversy would continue to absorb a lot of the attention of the Air Force Association. The August 1994 issue would actually put it as a cover story, and that's the image that we see below. So nonetheless, in addition to these 2 groups, the Committee for the Restoration and Display of the Enola Gay and the Air Force Association, we would also see the American Legion, which was one of the largest veterans organizations in the United States, also involve itself in the controversy. So finally, as all these prominent groups, veterans and non-veterans alike, are going to come together, they are going to start to put pressure on the U.S. Congress. So therefore, in August of 1994, we are going to see Representative Peter Blute, a Republican from Massachusetts, lead a bipartisan group of 24 representatives who began to denounce the exhibit as, quote, anti-American. Not only did they use this rhetoric to say that what was being presented in this planned exhibit was wrong and anti-American, but they also made threats. They threatened that if the Smithsonian did not make changes to the script, Congress would hold investigations and possibly reduce federal funding for the Smithsonian. I want to take just a little bit of a detour here on this next slide here, because we need to understand why this is happening now. And it wasn't just about the exhibit itself, but rather it was about something that was going on during this period in time, and that was known as the culture wars. And we're going to be focusing on the culture wars as they existed in terms of education. So the controversy surrounding the Enola Gay exhibit soon became intertwined with the culture wars of the early 1990s. During this time, there were efforts undertaken to establish national standards for primary and secondary education in the United States. And out of these efforts came the 1994 National History Standards. These were drafted, these standards of 1994, by a committee of academics, school teachers, and administrators, and they incorporated new scholarship on the history of women, minorities, and other sort of forgotten groups in history. In short, what we are essentially seeing here with these 1994 National History Standards is sort of history from below finally reaching grade school, middle school, and high school. Again, after being taught in college campuses for essentially the last 30 years, it's finally sort of trickling down into general American society, now in primary and secondary education. Well, not surprisingly, we are going to see conservatives in the United States voice alarm over these new standards. A prominent example of this was on October 20th of 1994 when the Wall Street Journal published an editorial, if you will, by Lynn Cheney, who was a prominent conservative voice. She was involved with the National Endowment for the Humanities previously. She published this editorial called The End of History. Now, in this article, she claimed that school children would now learn about people like Harriet Tubman. With Harriet Tubman, of course, being one of the prominent conductors, escaped slave and conductors on the Underground Railroad during the Civil War, pre-Civil War era. So she was worried that students would learn about Harriet Tubman at the expense of George Washington. They would no longer learn about George Washington, now they'd learn all about Harriet Tubman. Similarly, they would only learn, according to this woman, Lynn Cheney, they would only learn about negative aspects of U.S. history, such as the Ku Klux Klan in the post-Civil War era in the 1860s and 1870s, or the rise of McCarthyism and repression of the 1950s. So such criticisms, not surprisingly, influenced and mirrored those being made against the Smithsonian's exhibit. For instance, in August of 1994, in the Washington Post, conservative commentator Charles Krauthammer claimed that, quote, elite American museums, as he called them, had joined historians and educators in attempting to redefine American history in a way that assaulted traditional values and that tainted the image of America as a good nation. As we hear all these voices, veterans, representatives of the Air Force, we see veterans organizations like the American Legion, politicians, conservative commentators, all railing against the Smithsonian exhibit. The historians decide that they have had enough and they are going to strike back and defend the exhibit that they are trying to create. So the campaign that was carried out by veterans and conservatives succeeded in forcing the Smithsonian to revise the script. And I'm going to actually come back in the next slide to talk about what these revisions actually were. But I want to talk first about the fact that these revisions led to immediate blowback from the historical community. In November of 1994, in fact, more than 60 historians, including some of the Smithsonian's original historical consultants, signed a petition that accused the Smithsonian of, in their words, quote, historical cleansing. It complained of the inclusion of information that had long been challenged by historians as untrue. When some of these same scholars met with a Smithsonian official, they accused the museum of presenting an ahistorical exhibit. One of the participants in this meeting, the revisionist historian Martin Sherwin, and I want to do a little side note here. If any of you had watched, it came out last summer, Oppenheimer, the movie Oppenheimer. That movie is actually based on a book by this historian Martin Sherwin. Oppenheimer, of course, was the man who was responsible in part for leading the effort to create the atomic bomb. This guy, Martin Sherwin, again, actually wrote the book that movie was based on. Well, nonetheless, going back to 1994 here, he told the press after this meeting with Smithsonian officials that the revised script had, quote, nothing to do with the history as it is known by serious historians, which he blamed on, quote, political pressure. This, again, gets to that gap that we've been talking about this semester between so-called professional historians and the public. It's that slow trickle. Again, it took 30 some odd years before these things that historians had been talking about for decades finally reached the public ear. So as a result of that, that is what historians are talking about and they are angry about. That it is undeniable truth that what they put in this script initially really was the historical record, the historical reality. But again, most Americans don't want that hardcore look in history. They prefer the patriotic, celebratory picture of the American past. With this final slide of information, I'm going to do a play on the Lynn Cheney article, The End of History, because what we are going to see here in the conclusion of this controversy is not the end of history itself, but the end of revisionist history, I would argue. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Ironically, I want to make a point here of the irony of this. The American Legion and its congressional supporters, what we are going to find is despite all the kerfuffle over a script that they thought was too derogatory towards the U.S. past and the veterans' role in that past, they too rejected the revisions. So I want to talk briefly here about what were these revisions that were made to the script. Well, first of all, the material in the script that dwelt on the horrible effects of the atomic bombs were now removed. You no longer hear story about skin melting off the bodies of Japanese victims of the bomb being dropped. You no longer see the photographs of the Japanese victims of the atomic blasts in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Additionally, we would also see the Smithsonian alter the estimate of how many casualties might have resulted if the bombs had not been used and the United States instead had invaded Japan. If you remember, this was the central argument made by the revisionist historians, that Harry Truman did not have to drop the bomb. There would not have been a lot of deaths had the United States simply invaded, through an amphibious invasion, the Japanese mainland. So what we are going to see is the original script said that about 31,000 Americans would have died through an amphibious invasion of Japan. Therefore, basically the argument goes, Truman should not have dropped the bombs because 31,000 lives, yes, that's a lot, but it pales in comparison to the number that were lost as a result of the atomic bombs being dropped. So nonetheless, this number was actually changed by the Smithsonian in their script to something like 260,000 to 1 million casualties. This would seem to mean then that Truman in fact made the right decision. He actually saved lives because again, he could have saved 1 million casualties. There would have been 1 million casualties if the bombs were not dropped. So this is just playing with numbers here. They're basically changing what history recorded in the documents that the historians used. So nonetheless, despite these revisions, on January 24th, 1995, nearly 80 members of Congress, along with supporters from the various groups that I mentioned previously, demanded a cancellation of the exhibit. Somewhat surprisingly, the Smithsonian agreed to do this, and they chose to forego the larger exhibit. As you can see, this larger exhibit was going to include not only exhibits on the Enola Gay and the so-called delivering of the bomb, but rather the after effects in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a fight to the finish, the decision to drop the bomb. That was the most controversial part. This was going to be a 10,000 square foot exhibit. That was now all pushed aside. It was all erased. And instead, what was going to happen is there would now simply be a display of the Enola Gay B-29 bomber with little more than a plaque identifying the B-29 bomber and its crew. Thus, and here's the importance of this, at the end of the day, the commemorative voice prevailed over the historical voice. History lost out in favor of pure celebration. I want to end this lecture with 2 slides here and 2 cartoons, political cartoons that were published as this was all going on. Because there was a lot of backlash when the decision was made in early 1995 to cancel the exhibit. Here you can see the Christian Science Monitor, a periodical published in the United States. The sign in the back. This famous airplane was involved in an unpleasant situation which may or may not have been necessary, depending on whom you ask. This is obviously a play on the decision to simply scrap the entire exhibit and put the Enola Gay up there with 1 sign. But then the sign itself really is alluding to this idea about we don't want to sort of decry U.S. action. So therefore, instead of saying an atomic bomb was dropped that killed hundreds of thousands of people, an unpleasant situation, and may or may not have been necessary. This is the idea, again, of the revisionist historians arguing that, in fact, it was not necessary. So clearly, again, jokingly referring to some of the debates that were going on during this time over the Enola Gay. And of course, in this political cartoon from the LA Times, what we see here is the idea of the exhibit being scrapped. The Smithsonian avoids controversy, it says. We're returning to our original mission as the Air and Space Museum. Well, of course, the fact being that as you look at this, there is no exhibit. The Smithsonian is empty. The National Air and Space Museum is empty. And that is all that they can do because there is so much anger and fighting over whether the Enola Gay exhibit should do this or should do that. And as a result, it was simply, again, taken down nearly completely except for the Enola Gay event itself.